Now, I didn't really have time to make a proper video this week, as it were, just because I've been working at uni on this summer school, although most of the money that I get paid from that I'm going to be putting towards a new mic setup, so that's going to be pretty good. But nonetheless, I wanted to make something anyways this week, just a nice, quick, easy video, actually on something I've been meaning to do for a while, a kind of like reading list for newcomers to leftism, as well as something that you guys can recommend to people who might be convinced to leftism. And I'll be going through like different ideologies for people, because let's be real, throwing Lenin at some liberal who still thinks that Marx murdered the kulaks with his bare hands isn't really that productive. But anyways, let's get into it. So we'll be starting with books for people who are already sympathetic for communism and want to learn more. Now, if you follow me on Twitter or keep an eye on my Curious Cat profile, which you should do both by the way, you'll know that I love to push this book whenever I get the chance, and that's The State and Revolution. Now, this book is just perfect for any newcomer to communism, because it goes over the core concepts of what Marxism is. It goes over the workings of capitalism, and also the workings of socialism, and, as the title might suggest, mainly to do with the state in both. But as well as that, it also goes on the methods on how to attain socialism, and works as a brilliant kind of like critique to reformism and anarchism, and explains why the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is the only true path to socialism. I will mention, though, what Lenin tries to do in this book isn't to push his own kind of like organization or methods, like the Vanguard or whatever, like he does in, say, What Is to Be Done. In fact, what he's trying to do in State and Revolution is stay as close to literally just what Marx said as possible, because he was mainly trying to expose, at the time, one of the other most prominent Marxist thinkers, Karl Kortzy, a German social democrat who headed the Second Internationale, and supported the First World War. He was, at the time, distorting Marxism, almost castrating it of its revolutionary aspects, just because it would suit him at the time, because obviously he was the leader of, or one of the leaders of these parties, and wanted people to back reform. Also, a very basic understanding of the Russian Revolution helps here as well. Now, if you already know about the Russian Revolution, you could probably just skip like a minute through this video, I don't know how long. But anyway, all that includes is that you had the February Revolution in 1917 that overthrew the Tsar. Lenin was in exile at the time, so the provisional government was formed with the Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionary Coalition, headed by Kerensky was his name. Don't get that confused with Kortzy, because actually the first time I read through this book, because their names look kind of similar, I thought they were the same person for a while, and that's really dumb, but this was like 2 years ago, so basically, yeah, then Lenin came back from exile in Switzerland. And this provisional government, they were essentially going for like a liberal democracy kind of thing. They were trying to build up capitalism in Russia before any type of socialism was ever attempted. During which time they also didn't end Russia's involvement in the war, and were very much in the pockets of not only capitalists in Russia, but also Britain and France. So that meant that the capitalists in Russia and the syndicates could just completely fuck over the Russian people as they wanted, and the provisional government had no teeth to do anything about it, because they were reliant on these capitalists. So what Lenin then did is he grew insanely popular in a very short period of time, mainly on the promise of pulling Russia out of the war, which is something the provisional government couldn't even do if they wanted to. So then you had October 1917, where the provisional government were overthrown and Bolshevism happened, and it was great. Obviously there's a shit ton more to that, but, we don't need to explain it all here. If you do want to know, another really quick book recommendation, Revolution at the Gates, brilliant book, but anyway. So, State and Revolution was actually written between this time period in February and October, but was published after the Revolution. And Lenin actually had to stop writing the book, it was never finished. There's a 7th chapter, but it's never finished. Because obviously he had to go and do Revolution. And it's brilliant what he says at the very end here. I did not manage to finish the writing of a single line of this chapter. The hindrance was a political crisis, the eve of the October Revolution of 1917. It is much more pleasant and useful to undertake the experience of the revolution than to write about it. Now, there is some debate to what extent Lenin properly actually interpreted Marx. However, for someone new to communism, these small things aren't really important, so I would just go ahead and read Lenin and try and understand that as it is, and then later on you can start thinking about that. But do just keep in mind that, the best interpretation of Marx is always going to be Marx himself. So when you're done with the State and Revolution, I'd then recommend moving on to Wage, Labour and Capital. Now this book is actually 5 books in one. It's something the IMT does actually, it's really cool. It's the classics of Marxism, this is volume 2. And it comes with a bunch of like really cool books. Well, I say really cool books, a lot of them are Trotsky, but some of them are cool books, so But in this is included Wage, Labour and Capital. It's the very first one, and it's about 50 pages. Now, this pamphlet explains very clearly and concisely why wage labour is always inherently theft, breaking down how when commodities are sold on the market for profit, this profit must inherently come out of the unpaid labour of the worker. Now, this was written for the general reader, however, there may be some terminology that Marx uses that if you have no background understanding of Marxist economics at all, you may find difficult to understand. The way that this is for the general reader is that it doesn't require you to understand Hegel before you read it like Capital does. But nonetheless, it can still be kind of difficult to get your head around some points. So you might want to check out Capitalism 101's playlist series on the law of value, which will just give you a rundown of some of the basics to do with that. Or if you want, you could just kind of read through it, and as you come up to stuff that you're not too sure about, just ask someone you know who actually does know about it to clarify for you. Whatever you want to do. But I'm just letting you know you may need to do something like that. Now, usually, value, price, and profit goes along quite well with wage, labour, and capital, which is another economic text written by Marx, and funnily enough, the very next text in this core classics of Marxism thing. But honestly, I'd say though that this one is more optional. It depends what you really want to kind of get out of reading here. This book mainly deals with the justifications, again without going into philosophy, for the labour theory of value. And it also deals with the age-old question of should workers be justified in demanding higher wages. Marx explains quite brilliantly, really, step by step, the economic implications of higher wages for workers in separate industries and all of that. And as you might expect, comes to the conclusion that yes, workers should demand higher wages. So honestly, this book isn't a top priority for understanding the core of Marxism. Again, depending on what you want to do, unless you're having day-to-day arguments with Ancaps over subjectivity, value theory, or whatever. Because, the labour theory of value is quite abstract most of the time. It's not really too applicable in the day-to-day. So again, it depends on what you're going for. Personally, I'm really interested in that kind of stuff, so I love this book. I will say that this actually is one of my favourite books of all times, weirdly. It just gets me hooked for some reason. The way Marx kind of goes step by step through the economic implications and explains how the macroeconomics works and stuff. Honestly, I think it just appeals to my love for maths, because I study physics and stuff like that, so maybe that's just me, but nonetheless I think that's worth mentioning. And if you do decide to read it, I think some context would be that for the first 5 chapters or so, keep in mind a chapter in this book is only 3 pages each, for the first 5 chapters or so, Marx is actually responding to another economist called Citizen Weston, but I don't know who that is because I googled that name and it just came up with references to the book. But anyway, and this guy is arguing as to why a rise in wages is actually detrimental to workers in the long term. So Marx first kind of spends his time dismantling this idea, and then he after that proposes his own idea on both the labour theory of value and how wages work. So after you've read Wage, Labour and Capital and possibly Value, Price and Profit, you should be ready to deal with probably one of the most important texts written by Marx that wasn't Capital itself, and that's Critique of the Gofer program. Now this is a really short pamphlet. In fact, there's more appendices in this than actual book. But don't let that fool you, it's extremely dense and quite difficult to understand. Almost every sentence actually means something quite important in this. Now, what Marx was doing in this is he was basically responding to a program set forward by, I think, the German Social Democrats, the Gofer program, where they were trying to outline what they wanted to do in society and establish socialism and stuff. And it had quite a lot of misunderstandings of what socialism was, and it just wasn't really that practical. Yeah, and it's the very rare time, or possibly the only time, where Marx really goes into detail on what socialism is and how it would work, which is why it's so important. He lays out the idea of labour vouchers, he lays out the idea of lower and higher phase communism and how that's a slow transition and then the differences between those two societies, and he lays out the political transition period between capitalism and socialism, and he lays out loads of other stuff too. So it's a really, really important thing that you kind of have to read, but it's worth waiting to read this till the end, but so that you have kind of a better understanding of other Marxist concepts before going into this, just so you have a better reference. Now, after you've read all of these, you should have a pretty good understanding of the core concepts of Marxism. Definitely to the extent that you could argue with pretty much anyone besides other Marxists or people who aren't Marxists but have actually read Marx themselves. And that's not many people. However, what's equally important to actually reading these books is then going and discussing the concepts in these books and arguing these concepts as well, just to make sure that you've properly understood and properly interpreted what you've read. Right, now let's talk about texts that are good for convincing people over to communism, and if you haven't read these, it might be worth reading yourself anyway. Now, the thing is here is what tends to work is going to change depending on who you're talking to, but what we're going to start off with here is actually something more universal to anyone on the political spectrum when trying to convince them about socialism. And that book is The Soul of Man Under Socialism, written by Oscar Wilde. Now, this book is just brilliant for new people and convincing them to Marxism on just so many levels. It's extremely short, at about a page long. It's written by Oscar Wilde, who's widely regarded and respected as an intellectual. It focuses in on individualism and how it flourishes under socialism, so instantly dispels that misunderstanding on that socialism is only for the collective or the greater good or whatever. And lastly, because it was actually written by Oscar Wilde, an actual poet, instead of some angry revolutionary or drunk philosopher, and then furthermore had to be translated into English, The Soul of Man Under Socialism reads beautifully. It flows really well and the use of language is great, so it's actually just really easy to read. And if you ever recommend this to someone and they say, oh, well, he only supported communism because he didn't see it in the real world first, and, you know, just point out that he wrote it after the Paris Commune happened. It's just a pretty good way to shut him up. Also, if you want to go down the route of recommending stuff to people written by widely known intellectuals, Einstein's Why Socialism is actually a pretty good essay for this, you know, especially if you're dealing with someone who's in STEM like I am. Now, I have read this, but it was like a year ago, and I can't really remember how good it was. I think I remember it deals with very basic concepts and doesn't really add anything new to the table like Wilde does. But nonetheless, that might actually just make it even better for people completely new to Marxism. And honestly, though, making this video has prompted me to reread this essay. So if I'm wrong on remembering it like that, I will leave a comment or something elaborating whatever else I find. But I'm pretty sure that's how it is. But it's a good essay, and the fact that it's written by Einstein in itself, I think, is worth reading. Now, a really good book for convincing a liberal or social democrat would be Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, which mainly deals as to why reformations of capitalism are never going to be permanent and why you can never actually fix these fundamental problems without a revolution. Now, the reason is that this is great is because Lenin deals with a lot of these problems in State and Revolution already, but the thing is, Luxemburg never came to power, and even though she was as revolutionary as Lenin, because of that, she never got any of the bad press she did in Western propaganda, so liberals just aren't afraid of her like they might be Lenin. So this might be one really good for someone who sees that there are problems in societies, but think they can still fix these within the context of the pre-existing system. And then lastly, for skeptics or alt-writers, provided that you can find one that's actually willing to properly read something, again, I think The Soul of Man Under Socialism is particularly quite good to go with, just because it focuses on the individual so much. However, sometimes you might find conservatives who are particularly interested in economics or anarcho-capitalists, and in that case, Wage Labour and Capital, again, might be really good for them. You know, mainly just because it goes into how wage labour is theft, like I've already explained, but towards the end of the book, it also goes into how wealth inequality is actually an inherent part of capitalism and actually is made worse for a good economy. And then it also explains how advancement in technological development actually cause a fall in rate of profit and cause companies in an industry where this technology has been introduced to have to produce even more just to make the same amount of profit, which therefore eventually leads to the crisis of overproduction and economic crash. And what's really great about this is that Marx assumes a totally free market. So there's no way that you can pin any of this on the state or anything like Ancaps love to do. And if you're dealing with someone who's really into their subjective value theory, then maybe throwing value, price, and profit at them works too. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry that it's very basic and just kind of me talking to a camera for today. But again, I just don't really have any time. But I hope it was still good. I hope people found the recommendations useful. Tell me if you managed to convince anybody with any of the recommendations. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.